Before you see anything in King Kong, you'll hear a raging storm. The Captain Englehorn waves down at you to get your attention. Then, after confirming that your character Jack isn't about to vomit, he yells down to someone else on your boat called Denim, the man he calls a lunatic, currently mounting a party to explore the mysterious island out in the distance, despite the storm and 20-foot waves. This lunatic is so single-minded in his pursuit of making a film that he ignores the words of warning from Englehorn, First Mate Hayes, and his own assistant, Preston.
I'm landing on that island if it kills me! Let's go, boys!
The group set out, and as the ship disappears into the mist and rain behind you, the shapes ahead come into focus. They're not just rocks, they're statues, something made by man, not by nature, now have sunken into the sea and crumbling fast. The game allows you to look around as you make your way to the island, but locks you to your seat. The director of this journey is the lunatic ahead of you, and you, for better or for worse, are along for the ride. The 2005 King Kong film is the kind of film that can only really happen once you've turned in 3 previously thought unfilmable movies back to back that each averaged about $1 billion at the box office and swept the Oscars. In November of 2003, less than a month from the release of the third Lord of the Rings film, Peter Jackson sat down with executives at Universal Studios to discuss the follow-up and his nearly lifelong passion project. The initial budget of King Kong was set at $150 million. However, that budget would grow, with Jackson eventually putting in more than $30 million of his own money to finish the film for an at the time record-breaking $207 million final budget, more than 2/3 of the original Lord of the Rings trilogy, or about one Hobbit movie. But all of that was yet to happen. After releasing Return of the King, Jackson would enjoy spending 3 or 4 days of his Christmas break playing a new game. Beyond Good and Evil was developed by Ubisoft Montpellier and was the follow-up to their previous series, Rayman. The game had an at the time very long and presumably expensive development time of 3 years, but upon release, Beyond Good and Evil failed to perform commercially, and the studio was in need of a hit. Luckily for them, one of the few who did play it at release was Peter Jackson. While Electronic Arts had developed the fondly remembered and financially successful Lord of the Rings games, when it came time to seek out game development partners for Kong, Jackson saw the team in France as a perfect fit. Ubisoft's King Kong game would set about recreating a film that was still in production while the game itself was being developed, a challenge at the best of times. However, little details like Kong's design, for example, weren't finalized for the film until after Jackson's team had released the first trailer in June of 2005, less than 6 months before the film was released. This is a bit of a nasty habit of Jackson's productions that had first appeared in Lord of the Rings with Gollum's design not being finalized until after the release of Fellowship of the Ring, and later the same thing happened with Smaug's design changing even after appearing in one film already.
Do you now?
The development team at Ubisoft not only had to adapt the changing film script to their own story needs, but also deal with shifting designs under even tighter deadlines than the team in New Zealand, all while also porting their work to the upcoming and still in development Xbox 360 console. So, given these challenges and armed with lots of money, an enthusiastic and powerful creative partner in Peter Jackson, and a veteran production staff, the team at Ubisoft Montpellier made it their mission to, quote, make their mark on the licensed game genre, and oh my god. Despite being developed in about 18 months, the game turns in some of the best art direction and technically impressive graphical effects of both of its generations. One example being these light rays, which we wouldn't see popularly implemented until post-2011 when Unreal Engine 3 made it a feature of their keynote presentation. It was then subsequently put into every game before full 3D volumetrics became feasible. While technical prowess is impressive, especially on a console that has less computing power than an Apple Watch, the impressive nature of these sorts of effects fade with time and ubiquity. In order to really stand the test of time, a game like this, above all, needs to have a strong sense of atmosphere. What makes something memorable is 1 part objective and 99 parts subjective. In the case of King Kong, my nostalgia plays a major role, but I do believe that the game deserves to be talked about in the same breath as any other well-loved games from that time, because it puts in the work to be a good game outside of that nostalgia. To boil it down to 3 categories. Number 1, visuals are the most obvious and apparent way a game communicates. Some games have been marketed based solely on their visuals. But games like The Order 1886, while conjuring up an extremely compelling visual frame, are not well known for anything outside of that. The story is serviceable and the gameplay isn't bad, but neither of those are really mentioned when this game was discussed because there just wasn't much to say about it beyond holy shit the first time you see it. Fast forward a decade where games have been delivering comparable or better visuals for years with better mechanics and stories, and there are suddenly very few reasons to revisit The Order. Kong's visuals, of course, have been dated by time and hardware limitations, but especially when emulated, the visuals do stand up surprisingly well compared to other contemporaries, and work to bring you into the world effectively. Number 2, the world the game is set in. The design and execution of a compelling game world can make up for dated visuals or poorly aged mechanics. Every Bethesda game, up to and including Fallout 4, are rightfully lauded, if for nothing else, for their worlds. But the moment-to-moment gameplay, especially of older titles like Morrowind or Oblivion, are not the reason to recommend them, and serve as a barrier to new fans. By that same token, the newer games like Fallout 4 and Skyrim are much more user-friendly, but as may have been discussed briefly elsewhere, they lack the hardcore RPG mechanics and customization options of those older games that the series was founded on. Despite that, all of the games in Bethesda's modern catalog are played and talked about at a scale and frequency that is rarely seen in any medium. But the people who have spent hundreds of hours wandering through every corner of Morrowind, Cyrodiil, or Skyrim did so because the worlds that Bethesda's games create were incomparable to anything else, not because the gameplay was especially interesting. The world of Kong then presents a compelling and engrossing rendition of the horrific jungles of the film. Creatures both present in the film and never seen are represented here with an understandable hierarchy, and will fight each other if thrown into the same arena. The dazzling spectacle of the game's levels always communicate that sense of danger. Staying still is never an option, but going forward is treacherous. Number 3, possibly the most important and ironically the one thing that can't really be communicated through a video, is how it feels to play. Call of Duty, which launched its second entry just a few weeks before Kong, has been going for over 20 years off the strength of that initial control scheme, gradually evolving over time with aesthetic differences mixed in annually. Whether it's set in the future or the past, it's always Call of Duty, and that game feel is extremely important to maintaining that identity across the decades. Kong's controls are nowhere near as ubiquitous as the Call of Duty model, but work for the game especially well. No heads-up display is displayed for most of the game, with exceptions for button prompts shown the first time you perform an action. The shooter controls are heavy and lack the sort of fine-tuned precision and aim assist of a standard console FPS, but the enemies and environment are tailored to that control scheme so that it never feels like your failures are due to controls, but instead due to your own failings, which I think is the mark of a good control scheme. The gameplay, the world, and the visuals all work together to try and make you feel something, and immerse you into the game. Immersion is a word that's used often. Too often in my opinion, but in this case we're not talking about some elusive sense of forgetting you're playing a game or watching a film or anything else. Rather, this is the sort of immersion of experiencing the game. Rather than tracking gameplay systems like ammo counts or companion health bars, the atmosphere of the game is tied so deeply into this sort of immersion that it's even built into the HUD, or lack thereof. While you can add a crosshair and an ammo counter to the game, by default both are absent, and the game is designed to be played that way all the way through, a rare feat at the time or now. The team at Montpellier managed to balance 2 major gameplay paradigms, and throw in a third for one half of one optional level. Jack is far from your typical protagonist of a first-person shooter, either of the time or compared to now. Even Alan Wake, another scared rider with a gun dropped into a nightmare, can still dodge, and on easy difficulty he can dispatch whole mobs of enemies with relative ease. This game has no difficulty slider. And again, even the most powerful weapon in the game does not guarantee a hungry Venatosaurus will get to you before it's put down. From the perspective of Jack then, the island is overwhelming. Jungle stretches out to the horizon and bugs the size of cars crawl out of walls in the chasms. On land, dinosaurs from the size of a dog to the size of a fucking bus constantly hunt you. There's no safe place to be on Skull Island, and that feeling of anxiety is part of the game's dedication to immersing you into Jack's viewpoint. The experience of playing as Jack functions largely as a survival horror game, with players placed directly in the moment and constantly improvising. Each level's challenge is based on what you brought in at the start versus what's available to you in the level itself versus what obstacles are in your way. One of the only advantages Jack does have over the creatures on the island is his brain. By utilizing those aforementioned fire, bait, and bones or spear mechanics, Jack is able to progress through the levels step by step. Each level then ends with a huge sigh of relief before the inevitable plunge back into hell. To balance that then, we have the second protagonist, the one with his name on the box. Not him. During the Kong segments, you're dropped into a world that you are so perfectly attuned to, you can almost glide through it. Dinosaurs and monsters that would devour Jack in an instant are thrown aside by Kong without a care. If playing as Jack is a survival horror game, then Kong is an action-adventure. The gameplay setup is similar to an older God of War title, or a Devil May Cry, or even a LEGO Star Wars game. A camera is preset, it follows the movements of the player through the level, and frames the action and player goals in specific, exciting ways. The player then wipes out enemies, mashes buttons to open gates, and progresses through the environment until the end, where they are given a cutscene. The benefits of this style are that your immediate goals are framed and understood. The HUD is still absent, with button prompts only appearing if it's the first time you're doing something, or if you've forgotten and are button mashing. Like the film, Skull Island is the most dangerous place in the world, and Kong is the most dangerous creature on Skull Island. Kong plays like a wrecking ball, an unstoppable force with the only thing between him and the goal really being time. But even in these moments of power, the sense of a ticking clock or a growing sense of the inevitable is almost suffocating. The enemies may not be difficult to kill individually, but their numbers are endless. Death will come for you from the final straw, rather than some new and imposing threat. Later in the game, we see Kong's lair. It is littered with the bones of his family. On an island full of one-of-a-kind species, Kong is the most endangered. Despite the melancholy of the story, his levels offer a short and sweet power trip, and then the level ends, and you return back to the body of the writer, desperately trying to survive an island where everything on it wants you dead. However, not satisfied with delivering two distinct gameplay systems into this game, Montpellier threw in a vehicle section, and a good one at that. Spoilers for a nearly 100-year-old film. In an alternate ending, everything starts as you might expect. Kong climbs the tower, the planes appear, and he starts his final stand. However, halfway through this fight, backup arrives for Kong in the form of Jack and Captain Englehorn, both flying a seaplane we saw so much throughout our time in the island. Now equipped with machine guns mounted to the front of the plane, we're given full 3D flight controls, similar in concept to the flight sections of Beyond Good and Evil, which is perhaps how the Montpellier studio was able to include such a competent implementation of flight mechanics in a game that never before or after the sequence will use them. The premise is simple. Shoot down the slow-moving enemy planes and try not to get shot down yourself. After clearing the skies, Kong descends back down the tower and we're presented with a flowery and sweet ending that could never really be. It's just one of the several large and small choices this game makes to make its rendition of the King Kong story its own, related but distinct from the 2005 film it's based on, as well as the 1976 film that I hate, or the 1933 original. As an avid fan of the film since he was young, Peter Jackson, along with his co-writers Philippa Boyens and Fran Walsh, ended up writing a 3-hour epic, which, much like the Lord of the Rings films and later Hobbit trilogy, would seem to almost burst at the seams by the end with ambition and time constraints. The game, then, would endeavor to deliver an equally ambitious, if not quite as long version of the story to its game. For a direct comparison, the bug sequence in the film is horrific and critical to the story it tells. This sequence shows why Kong is brought back to New York. It's because Denham's camera is destroyed, and the only way to save his skin is to bring back proof, real proof, of what they all saw there. It's also the scene that separates Jack from the rest of the crew and sets him up as both the savior of Anne and the unwitting participant in Carl's scheme. While that bug pit sequence may have worked in the game, the team chose to cut it and instead have Kong knocking the crew from the log be what separates them outright, with Jack landing on one side of the chasm and the rest on the other. Like the film, this is also where Denham loses his camera and all the film inside and begins planning to bring Kong back to New York. Jumping to the end of the story then, In the film, Kong spends more than 30 minutes rampaging, ice skating, and parkouring over and through the streets of New York. Starting in the theater, we see Kong as a broken animal, only motivated to action after seeing who he thought was Ann before being duped. He snaps the chains easily enough, throws some chairs and people, but his rampage really starts when he sees Jack, the man who took Ann. After blasting through the theater onto the streets at light speed, Kong maims, or worse, about 90 people, makes Jack do a backflip, reunites with Ann, and summits the Empire State Building to take in a beautiful sunrise before his executioners arrive. The last we ever see of Kong is this shot of the light literally going out of his eyes, and this line from Carl Denham.
"It was beauty killed the beast."
For the game then, the runtime of the ending is truncated. The entire level can be finished before Film Kong even makes it from the theater to the Empire State Building, even including the alternate ending. For this version of events, Kong rampages through a series of city blocks, taking out searchlights and throwing cars at the National Guard. He finds Ann and makes his climb. At the peak, the sun never rises. Planes come close enough to grab out of the air, and you can really put a dent in the numbers of the 1930s American Air Force. But inevitably, Kong does die. The humans are left to question, and in some cases mourn, the events that have happened. There's a sense of tragedy that is translated so well from screen to game that it's impressive even amongst the game's more notable accomplishments. King Kong has earned its reputation as a licensed game that punches well above its weight because this game was crafted with the same sort of love and passion that goes into an original IP. This game could have easily been made with half the effort and still been expected to sell well, with the new Xbox 360 customers alone hungry for games in the launch window. But like the film, the effort was made, and the result is an influential and enjoyable gaming experience that almost makes you forget it was ever based on a film in the first place. If you have an original Xbox, PS2, or GameCube at hand, the game can be found for relatively cheap online, with the 360 version going for higher since it can be played on modern Xbox consoles. The PC version is also available, but with several confusing versions available, with one including just straight up spyware, I haven't bothered to try and decipher which version to recommend here. The film is also a sort of hidden gem despite its massive budget and successful box office run. The runtime is a consistent criticism, but the world made for this movie is one of the most dense and believable ever committed to film. It is also the last of Jackson's major blockbusters shot on film, and to utilize miniature effects. This isn't really the place to argue whether miniatures and/or film are inherently better or worse than digital effects, but it is an interesting look at one of the very last large-scale miniature films ever done. The making of documentaries, plural, and production diaries, also plural, cover more than 6 hours of behind-the-scenes content, plus an extensive audio commentary on the film. This amount of coverage has never been the norm, sadly, but Peter Jackson films stand out and have set an extremely high bar for behind-the-scenes content on filmmaking. The Lord of the Rings films famously come with roughly 2 hours of behind-the-scenes content for every hour of film. Unfortunately, the Kong game comes with about 15 minutes of behind-the-scenes content plus a 9-minute interview with Peter Jackson. Even more unfortunately, this is around average. Even now, 20 years after this game was released, game development is nowhere near as well documented as film development outside of promotional pieces, though organizations like NoClip are changing that slowly but surely. Personally, I would love to see more about how this game was designed. How did they develop and prototype ideas like the fire system, the companion AI, and developing the alternate ending? But unfortunately, what information there is scattered over articles, interviews, and of course this featurette, and there isn't a whole lot to go around. To sum it up, this game, this film, and the moments they represent in film and game history are fascinating. To me, it's a watershed moment. There are licensed games before Kong, and licensed games after. It's the high watermark for a maligned genre, and that mark is so much higher than the standard, it virtually stands alone. Spider-Man 2 is really the only other game that I could think of that could even compete for that title, with maybe the X-Men Origins Wolverine game thrown in as an honorable mention and GoldenEye grandfathered in. My thoughts on the game should be evident by now, so instead I'd like to pass the conversation on. If you have thoughts to share, please comment below. I do read everything. As of this writing, I have 0 subscribers, and no one outside of a few friends even know I'm writing this, let alone recording it. It will be interesting to see if this video or this channel finds an audience over time. Regardless, thank you for watching.